Today we see the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa do their best, including, new participants from other countries, try to set up a stage where they can de-dollarize the planet. Now, technically speaking, when the gold was still backing our currency here in the US, right, an international currency, it was just held as a reserve in our treasuries, right? The dollar was still the main currency being exchanged around the world. I don't think that'll change with a commodity-based currency. I don't think people are trying to, and countries are trying to become the world status. I think that'll still be the dollar. I think what they're trying to do is have it backed by something, right? And that's the de-dollarization effect. It's not really getting rid of the dollar, it's giving it value from the current fiat standard that we have today. And we see that BRICS nation, with the yuan, Chinese yuan, and let's say the Brazilian real, they're starting to, negotiate and do trade agreements with one another where they bypass the US dollar and they start exchanging their own currency. Brazil gives real to the Chinese gives yuan to the Brazil, and they say, hey, we got these commodities under our jurisdiction and that will support our currency. Eventually, who knows? Maybe there will be exchanges of foreign exchanges on the platform that this world stage is basically evolving into, where multi-currencies are exchanging with multi-currencies, but the value of their currency is at least backed by their treasuries of their commodities, of their oil reserve, natural gas, gold, you name it. So in this future, perhaps maybe the US can say, hey, you know what? That's not a problem as long as, ours is still the main one on the charts. We don't mind backing our currency too. Imagine the US dollar incorporates gold as a treasury reserve. That will be huge. Instead of closing the gold window like Richard Nixon did in 71, now we open the gold window and say, hey, we got gold. We're going to back our currency. Now, it might not be a one-to-one exchange, right? You don't go and it's not going to be like a gold back. What it might be hey, here's a security, here's a bond. It has a 10-year duration. At the end of that, then you may redeem it for gold, right? And so that might be interesting, where the treasury reserves or certain lengths of bonds, long-dated bonds, might be backed by gold and silver. More for long duration plays. That might stabilize quite a bit. We see an early sentiment by Lula, the president of Brazil, basically, share his opinion that why is the trading of the world backed by US dollar and not by their own country's reserve, right? They want to have their currency be used on the planetary stage when it comes to trading. Why is it that the US, a lot of countries are pondering this. I'm sure it's not just President Lula, Brazil. These same countries are probably pondering who was it that, allowed the US dollar to continue when they can no longer back their currency by gold. I'm sure a lot of countries rich in gold and have access to a lot of gold are probably thinking, man, we would probably do a lot better if we backed our resources by gold rather than just the fiat standard. Now, if you're not a nuclear country like Saddam Hussein, you got by talking like that. We heard that Omar Gaddafi, same thing, If you're not a nuclear-backed country and you're starting to talk like this, to get rid of you, as we saw, right? By the Congressional Military Industrial Complex, we saw that they go anytime somebody speaks out like that. But Russia, the reason we haven't gone into direct war and there's like this proxy Ukraine thing situation that's happening is because they're a nuclear nation that is talking like this, right? In the BRICS nation, Russia does have nuclear warheads, right? Well, it's a little different when you have nuclear warheads and you're talking smack, right? Versus like Saddam and Gaddafi, who didn't have warheads. That's why they can go. But Putin has warheads, so it's not as easy to go because he might and the whole thing might and that's a hot mess, right? With the Federal Reserve increasing interest rates for almost the last year, 10 consecutive times, this has put a lot of strain on the international community, especially when it comes to lending products. Not only that, with the strength of the dollar being at a really strong position right now, it's even more tough for these countries to make payments on their existing debt or even try to maintain the strength of their currency and give them some power as well. Not only are they feeling the effects of their currency being a little bit shaken by the strength of the US dollar and the interest rate that currently exists, with the sanctions that were imposed on many countries, but particularly the Russian community, when we sanctioned them, that, like I said in the previous video, put a huge global shockwave, and everyone's treasury reserves in all countries of the government that hold them into DEFCON 5 alert. And when you have DEFCON alerted, guess what? You're going to look for hedges. You're going to look for strategies. You're going to try to find out logistically how you can preserve your country and your country's wealth away from something that can be weaponized, right? So imagine so many countries are getting together trying to find independence from the US, meanwhile trying to find a middle ground because they're still conflicting. You know, we still see China and India still butting heads across the border, but they might have a common enemy. But there's like, okay, we still need to work together. We're going to dispute over this and that and the next thing, but we still need to be able to have almost a trustless system where we can trade. And that's where gold comes into play. At the end of the day, if BRICS doesn't use, commodity-based currencies or gold or anything like that, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, shared last summer around in 2022, right, that the BRICS nation are coming up with a new currency that is actually backed by a basket of other currencies. We see this already being implemented by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has something called the SDRs, the special drawing rights. The special drawing rights are backed by a basket of participating nations, and the IMF backing this reserve currency, the special drawing rights, right? And so the BRICS nations are actually putting together, if they haven't actually publicly released it, I'm sure they've worked on it for a whole year now, a very strong foundational idea that may be backed by commodities, right? Because that's where a lot of their resources are held. That's where a lot of their strength is. And that's actually maybe, I wouldn't say it's the Achilles heel of the US. That's more of the Achilles heel of the ECB, because they don't have a lot of resources. So Christian Lagarde might have a whole hot plate against herself with that idea. And what Jerome Powell's doing, he's giving her a jab, he's giving her an uppercut, man, she's getting messed up. But anyways, outside of the ECB, we see a basket of reserves that they are actually trying to back with their new currency in the BRICS nation. As we all know, in March, China's data has shown that they've used the yuan more than the US dollar for their trades. All right, big deal. Guess what? The world still uses the US dollar as the majority in terms of transactions and settlement and treasury, so we're still bodying them by no choice. Even if there's some participating countries out there like Argentina that are trying to move away from dollars and they're accepting yuan, de-dollarization is going to take a long time, and even if it does, we're still going to be the reserve currency of the world because we've established such a large platform on the planet, and there's so many countries that are pegged to us or even trying to come close to being pegged to us, right? If they don't peg to us, and they depeg, guess what? Their economy goes through hell. So it's going to be very tough for a lot of countries to de-dollarize, first of all. Second of all, if they do, guess what? We're still going to adapt. We still got a main chokehold on the planet. If they come up with their tactics, we adapt our logistics. Now, China is trying to, increase their global payments participation. Currently, it's at 2.2% of global payments are being used in yuan. They are trying to increase that, but they're not trying to open their accounts. They're not trying to open up so countries can come in and use their open accounts like the way the euro and the dollar currently is standard. So it's going to be a little challenging if you're not going to open your account so the world can use it more often, but you want to increase your usage from 2.2 to whatever. It's going to be tough. Now, without this open sort of system, and yuan still wants to be majorly managed, we see that Russia, it has incorporated a lot more trade recently since it's been sanctioned, and now yuan is basically the fourth major currency that's being used in Russia. What's really crazy? Before the sanctions, before the Russian-Ukraine war, Russia's currency market was only 1% of yuan that was held there. Right? After the sanctions and after the Ukraine-Russian war, their currency market in Russia has jumped from 1% to low 40s, so 40 to 45%, depending on what day you check. That is massive in terms of their currency market. We see that this is their strategies to bypass the sanctions and increase the amount of yuan, their allegiance is essentially getting closer as we see this war and how the US is participating and its NATO allies are pushing those two together. 1% of the currency market to 40 to 45%. That is huge. This increase is only seen in Russia. We also can see from the SWIFT system that as of February, it reached 4.5%, where it was once 1.3% 2 years ago. Now, this still doesn't hold a candle to the US when it comes to currency trading, because we're still at 84%, baby. Many people around the world, including domestically, have actually been talking about the demise of the US dollar. We've heard that since even before the euro was invented. I remember when the euro was coming about, people were like, oh my God, this is gonna hurt the US dollar and our hegemony. What are we gonna do? No, none of that happened, right? Even with the BRICS nation, none of that will happen. Right? So a lot of this de-dollarization that may or may not happen won't actually be as earth-shattering as people are panicking and talking about. I think it's a little bit hysterical, but there's no currency that's trying to replace the US dollar, right? They see that what happens with fiat, this is the peak of fiat, where you have the payments network system, you have treasuries. The US dollar is the peak of fiat. They're seeing that that's not sustainable. So no other fiat around the world wants to take that place. They don't want to run deficits. They don't want to have all of this stuff. They don't want to lose their manufacturing departments. No country wants to replace dollars. I promise you that. What they want to do is bring back commodity-based resource currencies, right? They want to make sure that it's backed by something worth of substance, rather than some immaterial faith that never actually pans out. Because historically, we see empires crumble when it's like that, right? Even though countries don't want to replace the US dollar as the global standard currency for international trade, what they do notice is what happened to the sanctions in Russia. Even though there might not be in those conflicts between Russia and Ukraine or NATO, and they're just third-party observers, what they're noticing is it could be weaponized, right? And so they want to hedge their bets. And I don't blame them. You'd want to hedge your bet too. If you saw your neighbors fighting against your other neighbors, you're going to be like, you know what? In case there might spill over into my area, I'm going to get some insurance. That's all they're doing. They're just trying to get insurance against the spillover between two major forces. Now, I'm sure there's some countries out there that actually don't like the dependency that they have on the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes and manipulation on that point. But it's not a big of an issue when it comes to the global stage. Now, with tighter monetary conditions and borrowing standards, whoever was borrowing in US dollars did have a contraction in their economy, and they might, be the ones who are most affected when it comes to this stage as well. We see during and post-pandemic that a lot of these countries have already inflated their currency and prices have went up drastically in their supply and material. Either way, they would have been inflated just because all their central banks were trying to make ends meet. Russia was definitely the most outspoken, particularly Putin, during this time because they're trying to befriend China and they're trying to defy US and Europe. But Russia isn't the only one who feels this way. We see Brazil and Argentina also starting to show this sentiment as well. Zoltan Pozsar, now the head of short-term interest rate strategy at Credit Suisse. He was the former Federal Reserve and US Treasury Department official. He believes that the world is going towards a multipolar world where there is first stages as well for deglobalization. Now, some of you may know that the BRIC nations were actually coined by a term. There was an economist at Goldman Sachs back in 2001 who put the word BRICS together. Back then it was Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Later on in 2010, 9 years later, after 2001, was South Africa added and it became the BRICS nation. Now, them coming together just haphazardly, basically by this Goldman Sachs economist, and they're just saying, okay, this might be some new contender that's trying to, have an allegiance with one another and trying to make up our currency. Nothing was really substantiated yet, you know what I mean? So later on, after 2010, South Africa was added, and today we see over 20 years ago, they've been around. This conglomerate of haphazardly randomized nations coming together may or may not do much, right? Well, we're gonna have to wait and see. We do know that the total for those five and new participants, but specifically those five, their GDP does actually outperform the G7 GDP. So that we have to keep a close eye on that as we see that, their GDP is stronger than the G7, and that might have a little influence on how things will probably pan out. But more importantly, when it comes to the BRICS nations' GDP and, the influence that they may have, we see it's mainly China and India. But if you look further, it's mainly just China. We see that China actually has 72% of their GDP is what's keeping the BRICS nation afloat. Alongside that, 80% of the growth that's happening in the BRICS nations is from China as well. And they also hold the most amount of external surplus. Not only that, some newly membered nations outside of the major, the central five, like Saudi Arabia, are large producing oil, countries, and they actually care more about how oil will be stored than most BRICS nations do. Now, when BRICS nations increase their amount of gold that they have in their reserves and decrease the US dollar treasuries they have in the reserves, this isn't a weakness of the US treasury reserves. What it's really doing is more of alongside of as nations grow, right? And their GDP over the last, say, 20 years, for the BRICS nations specifically, as they were developing, they had a certain amount of reserves. And as they were increasing and making more profits, they said, hey, how do we allocate this new money to our treasuries, to what they hold? So they already have US treasury bonds in there, and they're like, okay, let's diversify a little bit. We'll hold a little bit of Swiss currency over here. Let's increase our portfolio to this allocation and that allocation. And we see over time, the last 20 years, the reserves in general have increased, and they've just diversified, right? Yes, they would still buy, US Treasury during that time, but they would diversify with gold and other assets as well. So even though the percentage is coming smaller, it's because the reserve amount worth, right, is increasing. So it's not really a weakness. What's happening is that the countries are, around the world have been doing a lot more trade. The world has been globalized in the last 20 years, and, interconnected trade has increased a lot of treasuries around the world, their central banks and their countries' reserves dramatically. And so they're just hedging and diversifying their portfolio as if it was an actual portfolio, as if these treasuries were well managed. For example, during the Bill Clinton administration, we've outsourced a lot of manufacturing local jobs from here all the way to China. That way we can import at a cheaper cost. Now, during this time, China has developed and grown quite a bit, right? And they've started to develop their treasuries and how much reserves they have in their country, to the point where they said, you know what, we're going to start diversifying into agencies and equities as of 2005, because they've accumulated quite a bit of treasuries, right? So they just want to hedge their bet, right? And we see this continue where they were just decreasing the amount of US treasury exposure, increasing the amount of agencies and equities they would hold in their portfolios, like an investment portfolio, up onto 2011, 2012, where they're saying, okay, we're no longer going to be investing in US treasuries because we have so much, that's most of their reserves. Increased the amount of gold that they've bought in the last, we see this from the 2011, 2012, and before that a little bit as well, but it's been increasing quite a bit since those last 10 years. During the last decade, we see the Belt and Road Initiative by China increase their exposure to diversifying their investments as well. And when a country chooses to diversify into other assets and sectors, that's not always very profitable, like we saw with Saudi Arabia. When they put in large investments for SoftBank Vision and Credit Suisse, that didn't really pan out too well for them either, right? Saudi Arabia is also investing in this new 15-minute city idea that everyone's been hearing about, where it's essentially a 170-mile long city, right, in a linear straight line, right, enveloped by these major walls, and essentially there'll be no cars, no streets, and zero carbon emissions. That's very fanciful. It should capacitate about 9 million people. It will be run by artificial intelligence, AI, and somehow, while doing all this, coexist with nature. Now, that's very optimistic. I don't know if people will like it in the long run or not, but all I can say is that is more risky than, say, investing in a portfolio. Now, they can afford that because they have such large oil reserves, but not all countries will be willing and as bold as they are, right? I understand during these global crisis that we may get into, people and countries will have to take more risks, but that's one of those risks I'm just like, we'll have to see how that works out. As long as they don't use CBDC and take away our privacies and our freedom, I'm all right with that. Another country that didn't do too well in terms of diversifying their portfolio was Russia. After the Russian sanction that started in 2014, we see that their portfolio didn't do too well, right? And after the invasion of Ukraine, we see that actual Europe has cut off and included sanctions on them as well, and that didn't help them too much. But lucky for them, they did have some gold in their treasuries, and that sort of kept them afloat. It's going to be tough for the globe to try to de-dollarize because the dollar, out of all the dirty shirts on the planet, it's the cleanest in the hamper for a few reasons, right? It's the deepest and most transparent financialized markets on the planet. Not only does it offer the most flexible financialized markets on the planet, it also has the clearest and most transparent corporate governance as well. Many people will contend this idea, but once upon a time, it used to have a pretty good, standard, and it wouldn't discriminate whether you're foreign or domestic. Nowadays, with the sanctions and the way things are going, that's a little bit wobbly, but historically speaking, it was very neutral. Now, in order for a country, which I don't actually believe that wants to replace the US dollar as the global currency, will have to actually not only meet these same conditions, right, but they'll actually have to exceed it as well. And that's because, we know that you don't have to go to, decision by the judges after the 5 rounds in UFC title contender fight. You actually have to knock out the champion, right? You have to win undecisively. There has to be no decision, has to be no contest, right? That's the kind of decisions we're talking about. There has to be a completely, a better opportunity, and you offer better conditions than the current US dollar. And that's very tough to do just because of how much, transparency, flexibility that all the US dollar and their financialized markets and their trade and their network effect has brought to this planet. We see why countries use the US dollar and their treasuries as a reserve. It's because they have a lot of trade surpluses, meaning they sell to other countries a lot more than they buy. Therefore, they have this surplus, right? And so that's why they hold the US treasuries, because they just want to store that energy. And when it comes to global international standards, that's the most accepted because of the Bretton Woods Agreement, right? But also that it's been stabilized, right? There isn't a lot of, instability since it was, adopted by the planet. And with surplus economies internationally around the globe, when they don't import as much as they export, they sit on this reserve. And because these countries are sitting on this surplus in their treasuries, the US is the only large economy that's willing to have a deficit to accommodate those countries' surplus. Now, in theory, countries like China, who run, large surplus, could in theory buy assets from places like Japan and, Europe, which also have large surpluses. But other economies that are advanced alongside Japan and Europe, if they also have a large surplus on their balance sheet, but in addition to that are also net importers, like the US, where we are net importers, right? And if China goes to Europe and says, hey, we'll start using the euro as a reserve and not the dollar, the ECB, the European Central Bank, will have to tolerate and put up with enough of appreciation with the euro in the international markets, which would kick the leg under their export sector, right? It would undermine their exports and also force their economy into increasing their deficits as well. Or entail, they would have to, import a lot more reserves from China and hold those as reserves in their treasuries to counterbalance and neutralize the impact of the imports that China is doing. So it essentially boils down to, if China were to purchase more European reserves, Europe would have to purchase more Chinese reserves. And because of this balance that they have, ultimately, they would have to go to the dollar because we're the only ones willing to run a deficit. If Europe and China were to continue to do this agreement, that would basically increase the amount of euro that's in their supply to drastically increase, which would weaken their purchasing power as well. So instead of going down this path, which has been already established in history of buying, US treasuries, because we're the only ones who are willing to run a deficit, say between this example of Europe and China, what China is doing is saying, hey, let's diversify now, right? Because Europe doesn't want to expand their money supply domestically. And, the US already has a pretty good base that we have for their treasuries and our reserves. let's consider some commodities in our assets. We know that places like Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Russia are basically primarily commodity-based economies. And when things do well and the commodities are expensive, they tend to, invest more into that sector. But when their economies isn't doing too bad and the price drops of these commodities, they have to actually sell, right, to keep afloat. We see this in the volatility of the commodity prices during the war and during the pandemic. And in this volatile economy of commodities, when a country needs them the most, they can't be relied upon too much. And when the country doesn't need them the most, they are the most profitable. And the worst thing about a commodity-based economy is when the country needs them the most, they're the least valuable. And when the country does not need them and it needs them the least, the commodities are valuable. And that's the thing with commodity-based economies. That's the last thing these countries want when it comes to their reserves. And since China is the primary importer of commodities on the planet, the commodity prices actually impact China as well, as if they are actually the commodity exporter themselves, but the causality is just reversed. If China would be in a booming sector, right, in a booming phase, we see that they would be importing and buying a lot of commodities. Now, in a situation, if we were to think China is in a booming economy, they would be importing a lot of commodities, thus increasing the prices. But the opposite is also true, where if it's not a booming economy and it's a weaker economy for China, this would reduce the amount of commodities that they would be in demand for, thus pushing down the prices of commodities. So we can see that this is an unattractive proposition because China would be buying things high or they would be selling when they're low. So can the Chinese yuan be the reserve currency for the world or even just for the BRICS, since we see the Chinese are the main GDP and growth providers for the BRICS nation? Well, China has a dual currency system that helps control over their foreign investments and also regulates the exchange rate of their yuan. The Chinese renminbi is used mainly in the domestic area of mainland of China, and the Chinese yuan is used outside of the mainland for international trade. This dual currency system run by the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, prevents foreigners from moving money into China, and it prevents domestic citizens in mainland China to move money out and abroad. In order for China to become the reserve currency of the world, or for BRICS, they would have to give up capital control of their accounts. They would need to allow foreigners unrestricted entries and exits into their Chinese financial markets. This basically translates to that the inflows and outflows of these Chinese financial markets would be dictated by the international markets, the foreign investors, which would translate to China would have an impossible task of remaining in a surplus if this were to happen. Pretty much they would have to flip a 180 and not be a surplus economy, but be willing to hold deficits and issue more treasuries and have open unrestricted capital entries and exits of their financial markets in order to be even considered a world reserve currency. And since this is unlikely to happen and China will remain majority an exporter, right? That thus, with their profits, have to hold a surplus, they're more susceptible to rate increase volatility rather than, say, the US is. A rapid strengthening of the Chinese yuan would actually hurt their economy more than the strengthening of the US dollar would affect the US economy, because they're such large exporters. They want their money to be cheap so they can take that surplus and buy US dollars. But if their money is strong, their net profits are weaker, and it doesn't really help them too much either. So hypothetically, if the global structure were to change and the US would no longer be the reserve currency of the planet, that would create such imbalances across the globe that it would leave everybody very much shaken, and I would say even traumatized. Like there usually is when there's one global shift to another. It is hypothetical, but I wouldn't put, the eggs in one basket kind of situation on this bet to happen. Not only does the US have to run deficits so the rest of the planet can run surpluses, it also helps balance with whatever the world is doing in terms of their trade. So they help sort of, keep that pH at 7 while the rest of the planet runs, an alkaline base and we have to be acidic, or they have to be acidic and we're alkaline, not only do we have to be deficits while they run surpluses, we have to balance with what the world is doing. Before Richard Nixon closed the gold window in 71, before 1970, the world needed more savings, right? Because of the world wars and the destruction that brought to the planet. So the US was there running surpluses, which helped stabilize the planet. And since that time, as the world was healing and rebuilding and they started to accumulate their own savings, the US started to transform its role from running surpluses and being able to handle the deficit, as the Bretton Woods Agreement would back the US dollar for international trade. They said, okay, we're going to start taking away our surpluses, allowing you guys to, run your surpluses so you can continue to emerge as a global economy. Since we've already went through industrial revolution, we did so well, you guys can catch up to us. We'll run deficits, but our standards are going to be the international currency. And with that in place, they started, developing their economies as manufacturers, and industrialization took place around the world. And with their surplus trade, as they exported and made profits, they would hold US treasuries because the world was healing after the wars. We were savers that became, we took the responsibility to run deficits so they can become savers. And now the global currency around the world is standardized as US dollar. That means that if they hold treasuries, they can trade amongst one another. Now, if the US were to step back and say, hey, we're no longer going to be balancing out this world trade, you guys don't have to hold our reserve currency anymore, and basically step away from being the custodian, I don't think any country would step into that role, right? Imagining they have to change their economy, right? Going from an administrative role to an open market role, because they would have to have unrestricted inflows and outflows of their capital markets and current accounts, and it would be more volatile, it'd be more susceptible to market plays like we have today, rather than them, China or any other people that, or currency that's trying to, take over in place of the US dollar, and they would have to lose their administrative function for that system to exist. Now, if the US were to step back and say, hey, we are no longer going to be balancing all your budgets, you guys can no longer run surpluses on our costs, and we will no longer run deficits, and any of your large economies, whether it's China or somebody else, go ahead, feel free, become the world reserve currency. I doubt there will be any economy that will step up to that plate, right? And because of this, right, I don't think China will open up their markets. I think they want to keep administrative systems. I don't think they want to have an open market economy, right? Imagine there would have to be unrestricted inflows and outflows of their financialized markets. They would have to, essentially change their entire economy, and they would actually have to run deficits so the rest of the planet can run surpluses. I don't see that happening. I don't see any country being in a position, or conglomerate of countries being in a position to allow that to happen, or even volunteer to step up. It's a responsibility. There is privileges to it. Because of the world wars, we were savers. Then we had to do what we had to do, essentially, to allow the markets of the planet to have an open run economy. And it's not too bad. The planet has grown so much since. Now, I understand, the US has this, exorbitant privilege, and there's a lot of people out there, a lot of countries that are going to be complaining about it, but the capital markets are open, right? And there's a lot of countries out there that have capital controls, right? That don't want to take part of this exorbitant privilege. Now, these countries that have capital controls are in there, as much as to prevent, foreigners from buying local government bonds, as is, locals taking out their capital, leaving the country. There are so many countries as well that are actually preventing their currency from being a reserve currency. So even though a lot of people are criticizing the US for having this exorbitant privilege, a lot of these countries don't want that responsibility either. This exorbitant privilege that we have in the States essentially has the American farmer, producer, small business, worker have to pay a greater economic cost because we are no longer a manufacturing sector. This gets all exported out to these surplus nations, so they get the benefit of manufacturing, and then we have to buy it from them. Despite a lot of the conversations out there, I don't think the BRICS currency is going to be replacing the dollar anytime soon. What I might do is might just back their commodities to support the structure of their basket of goods. And, at the end of the day, that might help the US because the US might have to restructure and back their commodities with their dollar as well. And, going back and having a currency, a fiat backed by commodities might be beneficial for the planet in general. Now, while these trades of different currencies, multinational agencies, trade in their yuan and their rubles and their pounds and all of this, and then the dollar is still the number one traded currency because of what we've established, but now everything's pegged to a commodity, right? That will give structure, a lot more structure and growth, and actually I believe prosperity to the planet. And since I highly doubt that China, right, the main GDP and grower for the BRICS nations, right, by a long shot, is probably not willing to give up any of their administrative control of their currencies and their dual currency system, I doubt any currency on the planet, whether it's pegged by commodities or not, will be the standard, will replace the dollar. Now, yes, their treasury allocations might change. By all means, it might be healthier with more commodities and less on, government belief and trust and all of that. By all means, increase your treasury allocations to gold and silver. The world would be a lot healthier to that. But I don't think the payment platforms, I don't think the administrative function of what the yuan is going to be doing will ever replace the US dollar's open nature, open market sector. Now, with the history that the US has in terms of its open markets and China not allowing open markets, the other members in the BRICS nation, the other member blocs, are already in conflict a little bit with China. Like we see India and China borders, there's a little dispute there. So there isn't complete trust between them either, right? And since they already have treasury bills and already understand the system, while they're headbutting and trying to figure out, there isn't that cohesiveness that we would like to think they have. But, if they do adopt a currency that is pegged by some sort of commodity, whether it's gold or silver or a basket of goods, and then the Fed would have to do the same just to match sort of that par value, right? So people still use the dollar as the main structure for the international community. China is not going to open up their markets, right? They're still going to keep an administrative chokehold under dual currency system, and that's not going to look favorable for India or Brazil or anything like that. Yes, they might use the currency, but it's not going to be part of their treasuries. Commodities is going to be part of their treasuries, and this will basically allow their treasuries now that will be backed by the Federal Reserve dollars, and that being pegged to a commodity would also strengthen their treasuries that they have in their currencies. And overall, I don't think a de-dollarization is going to be enforced or is going to actually take place because there's no other system out there that is ready or even control or will be able to knock out the champ. Hit that like button if you learned something new. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't yet. Thank you for watching the Financial Almanac, and I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.